Introduction. Almost all urban specialists agree. All signs point to a grim summer of riots in the nation's cities. They note 1. Cuts and restrictions in federal programs for the jobless. 2. A hardening of white-black antipathies. A growing police emphasis on repression and weaponry. Some of their conclusions: nothing can stop it. The nation is building toward organized insurrection within the next few years. Newsweek, February 19, 1968. The invasion of Cambodia and the senseless shooting of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio have consolidated the academic community against the war, against business, and against government. This is a dangerous situation. It threatens the whole economic and social structure of the nation. Business Week, May 16, 1970. During the first 4 months of 1968, the Vietnamese Tet Offensive ended Washington's hopes of victory in Southeast Asia. Incumbent President Lyndon Johnson was forced to abandon his re-election bid. Martin Luther King was assassinated, and black rebellions erupted in more than 100 cities. Flames reached within 6 blocks of the White House. 70,000 troops had to be called up across the country to restore order. These jolts punctuated a decade of civil rights organizing, anti-war protests, cultural ferment, and youth rebellion that shook the entire country. For several years after 1968, the U.S. could not conduct business as usual. Looming defeat in Vietnam inspired more challenges to Western imperial power throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, then commonly termed the Third World. Marxism and anti-imperialist nationalism gained seemingly unstoppable initiative. At home, more U.S. constituencies added their weight to the energized black community in the early anti-war battalions. Youth-led protests surged in the Puerto Rican and Chicano communities. An Asian American movement was born. Native Americans revitalized their long fight for land and freedom. Women took up the banner of liberation. A new movement for gay and lesbian rights entered the fray. Labor stirred, with more and harder-fought strikes in 1969 and 1970 than in any year since 1946. All society was a battleground. A great deal was at stake, and powerful social forces were in conflict. On one side stood the country's traditional elite, accustomed to power and absolutely determined to maintain it. On the other side, millions mobilized because they were no longer prepared to accept unequal treatment or unjust wars. As in all popular upheavals, a portion of those who participated developed a long-term commitment to political activism. Many of them, seeing how intransigent the establishment was in resisting racial equality and defending imperial prerogatives, decided that the system could not be reformed. Looking at a country and a world in upheaval, they also concluded that the power of the oppressed was on the rise and the strength of the status quo was on the wane. They immersed themselves in and drew confidence from the spread of fresh ideas and organizations, the growth of revolutionary nationalist sentiment in communities of color, the development of the Black Panther Party into the central reference point for late 1960s radicalism, the emergence of the Young Lords Party and La Raza Yunda Party, anti-imperialist currents in Students for a Democratic Society, radical tendencies in the women's and gay movements, Detroit's League of Revolutionary Black War, Kerr's the American Indian Movement, and many more. By early 1971, public opinion polls were reporting that upwards of 3 million people thought a revolution was necessary in the U.S. Tens of thousands believed revolution was not only desirable but possible, and maybe even not too far around the corner. The appeal of Third World Marxism. Between 1968 and 1973, layer after layer of young people went in search of an ideological framework and strategy to bring that revolution about. Inspired by the dynamic liberation movements that threatened to besiege Washington with 2-3 many tents, many decided that a Third World-oriented version of Marxism, sometimes explicitly termed Third World Marxism and sometimes not, was the key to building a powerful left in the U.S., within the belly of the beast. In tune with the central axis of 1960s protests, Third World Marxism put opposition to racism and military intervention at the heart of its theory and practice. It riveted attention on the intersection of economic exploitation and racial oppression, pointing young activists toward the most disadvantaged sectors of the working class. It embraced the revolutionary nationalist impulses in communities of color, where Marxism, socialism, and nationalism intermingled and overlapped. It linked aspiring U.S. revolutionaries to the parties and leaders who were proving that the power of the people is greater than the man's technology. the Vietnamese and Chinese Communist parties, Amilcar Cabral and the Marxist-led liberation movements in Africa, Che, Fidel and the Cuban Revolution, in spirit as well as focus, all this fit the 1968 generation's mood much better than did the variants of Marxism offered by the 1930s descended Old Left. These had been shaped by the Soviet experience and were oriented mainly toward the trade union movement. Third World Marxism, in contrast, promised a break with Eurocentric models of social change, and also with the political caution that characterized Old Left groups, communist and social democratic alike. It pointed a way toward building a multiracial movement out of a badly segregated U.S. left. Third World Marxism seemed to many the best framework for taking the most radical themes struck by Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Cesar Chavez, the U.S. figures that most inspired rebellious youth in the 60s, and transforming them into a comprehensive revolutionary ideology. Partisans of Third World Marxism included organizers from every front of the 1960s rebellions. Committed to turning their newfound outlook into a powerful force, thousands spurned professional, academic, or business careers in favor of the activist life. They took steps to root themselves in industrial jobs, working-class neighborhoods, and communities of color, threw themselves into anti-racist and international solidarity campaigns, studied until late hours of the night, and passionately debated revolutionary strategy. Emergence of the new communist movement within the Third World Marxist ranks, a determined contingent set out to build tight-knit cadre organizations. These activists recognized that a slacking in mass protests could be on the short-term horizon, but they believed that any such lull would be short-lived and followed by upsurges even more powerful than those of 1968. And they believed that it was urgent to prepare a united and militant vanguard to ensure that the revolutionary potential glimpsed in the 1960s would be realized next time around. To guide this process, not just Marxism but Marxism-Leninism was deemed indispensable. Partly this was because the Third World parties they looked to for inspiration advocated Marxist-Leninist ideology, but they were also drawn to Leninism out of their own experience in sharp confrontation with state repression. And after all, even harsh critics of Leninism such as New Left leader Karl Oglesby acknowledged in 1969 that there was and is no other coherent, integrative, and explicit philosophy of revolution. Adopting this view, thousands of young radicals rejected the early New Left's criticism that the Communist Party USA and similar groups were out of touch because they were based on Leninism. Deciding that the real problem was that the CPUSA wasn't Leninist enough, they set out to build a new vanguard of their own. From 1968 through the mid-1970s, the resulting new communist movement grew faster than any other current on the U.S. left. At its height, it held the allegiance of roughly 10,000 core activists and influenced many thousands more. It was the most racially integrated socialist tendency, with the highest proportion 25 to 30% or more of people of color in its leadership and membership ranks. The largest circulation left newspaper of the time, The Guardian, promoted the new movement's outlook. New communist movement cadre were among the most hard-working and self-sacrificing on the left. Hundreds experienced blacklisting from employers, were beaten by police or right-wingers, and served time in jail. At least 7 were victims of political murder. As disciplined members of their various organizations, movement organizers played vital roles in numerous local and occasional nationwide struggles, giving top priority to trade union campaigns and the freedom struggles of peoples of color. They led grassroots strike support efforts for some of the biggest labor battles of the 1970s and the mass mobilizations against the first high court decision rolling back affirmative action, BAC v. California Board of Regents in 1977 to 1978. Among the Third World organizations that these cadre looked to for inspiration, the Communist Party of China, CPC, was then the most ambitious in presenting its views as a rallying point for leftists worldwide. With its Cultural Revolution, China also claimed to pioneer a new grassroots model of socialism. Largely because of this, Maoism captured the initiative within the early new communist movement, and Maoist tendencies were at first much better organized than the currents that looked as much or more to the Cuban or Vietnamese revolutions or to other variants of Third World Leninism. Of course, movement activists translated Marxist-Leninist doctrine into practical policies through the prism of their own backgrounds and experience. Theoretical pronouncements thus depict only one dimension of the new movement's underlying ideology. At least as important were the effects of its age, race, and class composition. The fact that most of its adherents had become radicalized, or for that matter had become adults, at the height of the dizzying 1960s, and that the movement included a substantially higher percentage of intellectuals and individuals from middle-class backgrounds than the population as a whole. And although some participants and critics portrayed the new communist movement as a near-complete negation of the 1960s radical currents from which it sprang, in fact the movement carried on and developed many strands of its non-Leninist 1960s heritage. Looked at from an even longer-term historical perspective, the new communist movement can be understood as one more in a century-long series of so far unsuccessful efforts to make socialism a significant force in U.S. politics. This movement's consensus was that a breakthrough could finally be made if top priority was given to tackling three long-standing dilemmas of U.S. radicalism. How can the U.S. working-class movement be put on a firm internationalist, anti-imperialist basis? What strategy can mobilize a successful fight against racism? And how can revolutionary cadre be developed and united into an organization capable of mobilizing workers and the oppressed to seize power? The audacity shown by the movement in grappling with these pivotal questions, not just in theoretical pronouncements, but in extensive practical organizing, accounts for much of its early 1970s initiative. But the movement did not prove capable of turning its initial momentum into long-term growth in numbers, influence, and internal cohesion. Indeed, it did not even succeed in uniting the bulk of its adherents into a single organization. Instead, over time, sectarianism, unrealistic strategies and tactics, and anti-democratic practices sapped cadre morale, repelled potential supporters and allies, and produced numerous organizational splits. Thus, after a half-decade of spectacular growth, in the mid-1970s the new communist movement entered a period of steady decline. Maoism fell into disarray following the death of Mao, 1976, Beijing's repudiation of the Cultural Revolution, and China's shift toward alignment with the U.S. under the banner of common opposition to the Soviet Union. As these changes unfolded, the movement's non-Maoist wing gained a measure of initiative and organizational strength. But no new communist group or tendency was able to adjust effectively to the rightward turn in U.S. politics that gathered momentum through the mid and late 1970s, and which they had not anticipated. None was able to galvanize or position itself within a durable, broad-based progressive coalition, or gain a solid institutional link to a large working-class constituency. Rather, between 1978 and 1981, many longtime activists left the movement and several of the most important groups split or collapsed altogether. A few of the more tenacious organizations survived to play important roles within the 1984 and 1988 Jesse Jackson presidential campaigns and Rainbow Coalition, but these groups were no longer surrounded by a larger revolutionary milieu, and they constituted a set of rival organizations rather than a common political trend. By the time the crises of 1989-90 engulfed every tendency in world communism, and much of the non-communist left, the new communist movement had spent its force, a lesson-filled experience. This 20-year experience constitutes an important chapter in the history of U.S. socialism, and simultaneously in the history of the New Left, anti-racist, and war and Third World solidarity movements. In particular, any evaluation of the tumultuous 1960s remains distorted and incomplete without grappling with the reasons why a Third World-oriented brand of communism captured the allegiance of thousands of the era's most committed activists. Despite this, the experience of the new communist movement is one of the most neglected in the existing literature about the U.S. left. Besides a few short articles written by spokespeople for its constituent groups, usually for immediate polemical purposes, the movement has received serious attention only in a few recent books focusing on 1970s people of color movements, where Third World Marxism had its most important impact. No comprehensive and analytic treatment of the new communist movement's origins, outlook, activities, and impact has yet appeared. This book attempts to fill that gap. Further, beyond filling in a missing page in the historical record, I attempt to draw lessons from the movement's intense political experience. What gave rise to it? How did it develop, and what were its strengths and weaknesses? What prevented the movement from building the mass-based revolutionary party it sought? And why did such a dynamic current end up leaving almost no institutional legacy for subsequent generations of radicals? History's trick on the generation of 1968 was that, despite appearances, the odds were stacked against building a revolutionary movement in the 1970s. U.S. capitalism was shaken, but retained immense economic, technological, military, and political reserves. Divisions within the working class and a deeply entrenched two-party system, key factors in blocking the development of a united working-class movement in the U.S. for generations, had been challenged, but far from overcome. Indeed, the essential motion of mainstream politics in the 1970s was not further to the left but to the right, as a conservative backlash rooted largely in the much-expanded suburban-based white middle strata seized the initiative. Abroad, third-world liberation movements had the capacity to win independence at tremendous cost, but lacked the economic base to break out of the capitalist-dominated world market. And the most powerful counterweights to imperialism, the USSR and China, were too hostile to one another to make common cause, leaving the US able to exploit this division to tremendous geopolitical advantage. For all these reasons and more, no corps of young revolutionaries could have created the mass-based vanguard of aspiring Leninist streams. For that matter, neither could they have reversed the overall direction of US politics in the 1970s. That said, it remains the case that the new communist movement mishandled the chance to register a significant advance for the US left. Serious discussion of revolutionary ideas filled the air in the late 1960s, but conditions for social revolution, or even for constructing a durable millions-strong anti-capitalist bloc, did not exist. But the realities of US politics did offer prospects for the consolidation of an energetic radical trend, numbering in the thousands, anchored in anti-racism and anti-imperialism, with institutional stability and the capacity to galvanize stronger popular resistance to the rising right wing. The essential failure of the new communist movement is that it ultimately dissipated rather than coalesced the forces that could have accomplished that task. Beyond generally underestimating capitalism's resilience, the movement did not sufficiently appreciate the structural obstacles to gaining a secure foothold in U.S. political life. In particular, the backward U.S. two-party winner-take-all electoral system erects tremendous barriers to revolutionary forces, translating gains made in periods of exceptional upheaval into a lasting base among the countries exploited and dispossessed. Navigating this difficult terrain requires tremendous flexibility. The pulls toward surrendering revolutionary politics in order to gain temporary influence on the one hand, or remaining pure but marginalized on the other, are immense. But the new communist movement did not even put this essential problem at the center of its deliberations. Rather, based on the hypothesis that upheavals even larger than those of 1968 were on the near-term horizon, the movement believed it could completely circumvent the county's existing political structures and still position itself to lead millions a short way down the road. Essentially, having come of age in the tumultuous 1960s, the movement's young cadre made undue generalizations from their intense but brief experience and embraced a voluntarist perspective on the pace and ease of social change, thinking that virtually anything could be accomplished if revolutionaries only had sufficient determination and correct ideas. This skewed perspective led directly to what Lenin himself had criticized as left-wing communism, an infernal disorder, 5 strategies and tactics that are out of touch with popular sentiment, rely on revolutionary rhetoric rather than effective participation in political campaigns, and shun compromises and alliances as threats to revolutionary purity. This ultra-leftism in turn pushed the movement toward ideological frameworks that reinforced rather than combated their voluntarist bent. Maoism, with its claim that the correctness or incorrectness of the ideological and political line decides everything, did the most damage. But the movement's non-Maoists, too, embraced rigid, simplistic, and ultra-left conceptions of radical politics. Integrally connected to the movement's voluntarism and rigidity was the tendency to pursue a quest for orthodoxy, that is, to go beyond general identification with the revolutionary working-class tradition in search of a supposedly pure and all but omniscient Marxism-Leninism. This dogmatic mindset stifled the movement's intellectual development, and in the organizational realm it reduced the complex task of building a mass-based radical party into the more formulaic process of building political sects. The irony here is that for all of this movement's audacious plans for social revolution, in a sense its failure was not due to thinking too expansively. Rather, it was because the movement shunned the true broad-mindedness and flexibility displayed by successful revolutionaries in favor of a narrow and mechanical perspective that this book dubs miniaturized Leninism. As for the individuals who passed through the new communist movement, thousands remain immersed in progressive activity today, especially within the trade unions and in communities of color. But though they draw heavily on the skills they learned during their years as Leninist cadre, they no longer function as a distinct or collective radical pole within popular social movements. Good 60s, bad 60s. While spotlighting the new communist movement's fundamental errors, I take issue in this book with today's conventional wisdom that the movement and the entire revolutionary left was a political aberration, an almost silly or even pathological reaction to the upheavals of the 60s. On the contrary, the turn toward revolutionary politics was a completely logical response to a generation's concrete experience. The new communist current in particular was a plausible, responsible attempt to overcome systematic injustice, at a time when hundreds of thousands of people were involved in or gravitating toward radical politics. The new communist movement stood out as the most ambitious and sustained effort of post-1968 radicals to combine the energy and creativity of 1960s movements with the working-class tradition and tenacity of the old left. Thus, there are positive as well as negative lessons to be drawn from this experience. In particular, the movement's insistence on giving prime attention to internationalism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and the need to forge a skilled body of revolutionary cadre pointed its partisans in the right directions. Not only were these pivotal questions for building a durable radical movement 30 years ago, but they remain, albeit in very different forms, crucial for revitalizing the left today. This is especially true as a new generation of organizers is now making its presence felt, who, like their 60s predecessors, are coming of age at a time when the left lacks a mass base and is fragmented along racial lines, and when revolutionary theory, strategy, and organizational models need a top-to-bottom overhaul. In making these arguments, I am of course challenging the interpretation of the 1960s that is now dominant within liberal and progressive circles, and especially within the academic left. That framework paints a picture of the good 60s turning into the bad 60s. Supposedly, the early 1960s movements stand out as humane, sensible, and worthy of emulation in contrast to the heartless, violence-prone, and irrational tendencies dominant after 1968, which are largely blamed for wrecking their more noble predecessors. This view is articulated most thoroughly in Todd Gitlin's The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, though the specific terms good 60s, bad 60s are those used by left historian Paul Buchanan describing the thesis of Gitlin's volume. The good 60s, bad 60s analysis is fraught with historical omissions. It is especially blind to the scope and impact of the late 1960s, early 1970s upheavals among peoples of color. This deficiency is documented by Elizabeth Martinez, who, in an incisive review of 24 books about the 1960s, indexed the near-universal tendency to analyze that era's left staked out with Eurocentric boundaries. It also rests on dubious political assumptions, which lift the late 1960s out of their historical context and gloss over the substantial differences between the challenges facing activists in 1968 to 1973 as opposed to 1960 to 1964. At their core is retreat from a systemic critique of U.S. economic and political structures. That retreat makes it impossible to comprehend the breadth and depth of grassroots enthusiasm for revolutionary politics that existed in 1968 to 1973. It bolsters complacency masked as maturity by underestimating how profoundly periods of intense conflict can alter people's conceptions of what is possible and desirable, and it leads to the short-sighted politics of declaring out of bounds by definition any project that takes seriously the possibility of building a strong radical movement anchored in anti-racism in solidarity with the Third World agenda. The first 4 sections of this volume traced, stage by stage, the new communist movement's emergence, evolution, and decline. Part 1 grapples with the complexities of the late 1960s and engages the good 60s, bad 60s debate. Its opening chapter details the events that led large numbers of young activists to turn to revolutionary politics between 1968 and 1973. Chapters 2 and 3 describe the process through which Third World Marxism rose to predominant influence within the new revolutionary ranks. Part 2 describes the emergence of a distinct new communist movement within the broader Third World Marxist milieu. It begins with the formation of the movement's pioneer organization, the Revolutionary Union, in 1968, and ends at the point when the movement achieved definite shape, 1973. An optimism about uniting its ranks in a single organization was at its height. Within this section, Chapter 4 recounts the origins of the various new Marxist-Leninist groups, while Chapter 5 examines the movement's practical organizing work and the initiative it held within the U.S. left. The next 2 chapters analyze the movement's theoretical positions and political strategy, with Chapter 7 devoted to analyzing Leninist doctrine concerning the Vanguard Party. The final chapter in Part 2 describes the movement's political culture and the structure and functioning of a typical party-building group. Part 3 details the evolution of the new communist movement from the promise of 1973 to the doldrums it found itself in at the beginning of the 1980s. This section's first chapter examines the political shifts which, beginning in 1974, began to check the movement's momentum. New complexities of the anti-racist struggle as manifested in the 1974 Boston busing crisis, the 1974 to 1975 energy crisis and deep recession, ever clearer signals that the country was moving to the right rather than the left. Chapter 10 analyzes the bitter debate over China's turn to alignment with the U.S. against the USSR, which in 1976 split the new communist movement virtually down the middle. The next chapter traces the attempts by a second wave of new communist groups to continue the vanguard building project following the setbacks of 1974 to 1976, and Chapter 12 explains the series of 1981 organizational crises that brought the largest of these efforts to an end. Part 4 tells the story of the tenacious organizations that survived the debacles of 1981 and tried to carry the main tenets of new communist politics into the fight against Reaganism. Chapter 13 focuses on these survivors' work within the main expression of 1980s progressive politics, Jesse Jackson's 2 presidential bids and the Rainbow Coalition. Chapter 14 examines how these last substantial remnants of a once promising movement collapsed amid the Jackson Rainbow Alignment's 1989 decline and the late 1980s events in Eastern Europe, the now former Soviet Union, and Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Chapter 15, which opens this book's concluding section, discusses the trajectory of new communist veterans after the movement's decline and analyzes their influence on progressive politics today. Chapter 16 explores the political legacy of the new communist movement and the main lessons from its experience. An insider's story, Revolution in the Air, ends on a forward-looking note, mainly because I still believe in the validity of the anti-capitalist revolutionary project, and I still vividly recall the experiences that first led me to this belief. While this book is not a memoir, it does draw upon my personal recollections as a participant in the 1960s radical upheaval and then the new communist movement. In the late 1960s, I was a member of Students for a Democratic Society, STs, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, one of the main centers of 1960s campus radicalism. I was aligned with the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 section of STs, seedbed of several early new communist groups. In the early 1970s, in Milwaukee from 1970 to 1972, and then in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was active in anti-war activity, labor organizing, and socialist educational efforts within the emerging new communist movement milieu. Then in 1976, I was a founding member of one of the main second-wave party building groups, the Line of March, in which I played a leadership role until the group's dissolution in 1989. I worked full-time for Line of March from 1978 until the organization's demise. Among other assignments, I was an editor of its newspaper and its theoretical journal, and I was responsible for many facets of Line of March's relations with other left groups. In the course of this work, I got to know, often in the course of interorganizational conflict, activists from virtually every part of the new communist movement as well as most other sectors of the left. Following the dissolution of the Line of March, I had the opportunity to interact with other leftists on a very different basis. In the early 1990s, a new climate of openness and re-examination arose following the advent of glasnost and perestroika in the now former USSR, and then the collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe. One effort to take advantage of this fresh atmosphere was Crossroads magazine, launched mainly by veterans of the new communist movement in 1990 to provide a forum for people from different socialist traditions to take a new look at our histories, theories, strategies, and prospects. I served as managing editor of Crossroads from 1990 to 1995. In that capacity, I had the chance to spend hundreds of hours in discussion with former polemical rivals, getting to see previous experiences from their points of view and vastly expanding my understanding of the last 30 years of radical organizing. Working at Crossroads also enabled me to engage in dialogue with many talented individuals from today's new generation of activists, giving me some insights into how they see things and what they have and have not learned from the past. It was in the course of these discussions that I was reminded of how damaging for 1960s activists had been the breaking continuity with a previous generation of revolutionaries, and I was struck by the glaring absence of material offering information and in-depth analysis of the new communist movement and, more generally, the revolutionary efforts of the late 1960s, early 1970s. At that point, the idea of putting together this history began to take shape in my mind. In 1995, I resigned as Crossroads managing editor, and by the end of 1996, I was able to free up enough time to begin work Hopefully, this process of dialogue and rethinking has given me sufficient critical distance to make sense out of the new communist movement's intense and controversial history. Of course, I have no illusions that the interpretations in these pages will satisfy all who participated in the movement's work or those who criticized it from other parts of the left. Even though sectarian passions, mine as well as others, have cooled, political analysis inevitably fosters disagreement and debate, especially when one writes about the workings of the left itself. If this book sparks criticism and further discussion of the left's history and future, it will have met a major part of its goal. In a more general sense, however, I do not claim to be nonpartisan. In the spring of 1968, in the apartment of a fellow activist at 1115 Spring Street in Madison, Wisconsin, I decided to make revolutionary activism my life's central thread. Though my opinions about how to implement this decision have changed and evolved, not least while writing this book, I have never regretted nor retracted the decision itself. Quite the contrary, my biggest regrets at this moment are that revolutionary ideas do not have more influence in our society, and that the left remains in the midst of a deep crisis of vision, theory, strategy, self-confidence, and organization. Yet I believe we will be a step closer to building a stronger left if we can sort through the experience of that complex combination of idealism, hard work, immaturity, critical analysis, misjudgment, hopefulness, sectarianism, self-sacrifice, and passion for justice that was the new communist movement.